Welcome to today's roundtable on the early African American legal community in Nevada. I'm Rachel Anderson, a law professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law, and I'll be your host for today. I'm very pleased to be here with this distinguished panel of guests. First, to my right, the Honorable Michael Douglas, a justice on the Nevada Supreme Court, who received his undergraduate degree from California State College, Long Beach, and his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of California, Hastings College of Law. To his right, Mr. John Bailey, a name partner and managing partner at Bailey Kennedy, a Las Vegas law firm, who received his bachelor's degree from Colorado College and his Juris Doctorate from McGeorge School of Law. To his right, the Honorable Judge Karen Bennett Herron of the Las Vegas Township Justice Court, who received her Bachelor of Science degree from Hampton University and her Juris Doctorate degree from Thurgood Marshall School of Law. To her right, Mr. Booker Evans, a shareholder at Greenberg Traurig, one of the top law firms in the United States, who received both his bachelor's and master's degrees from Northern Arizona University and his Juris Doctorate from St. Louis University School of Law. And finally, to his right, the Honorable Judge Tim Williams of Nevada's 8th Judicial District Court, who received his bachelor degree from Indiana University and his Juris Doctorate from Ohio Northern University. So thank you very much all for being here today. I'm very pleased and honored myself as an African American who grew up here in Sparks, Nevada, to be with this panel today. So let's start out by talking about the context into which the early African American legal community and attorneys developed. And the emergence of an African American legal community in Nevada goes hand in hand with the struggles of the civil rights movement. And I'd like to start out by looking at this movement and the development of the community from the perspective of those of you who grew up here and were here as children in the community from that time period. Judge Bennett Herron and Mr. Bailey, your fathers, the Reverend Marion Bennett and Dr. William Bailey, were both here at that time and were both civil rights activists here in Nevada. So I'd like to ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you remember from the context of that time, circa, the late 1950s, up through anywhere to sort of mid-1970s. And perhaps we'll start with Judge Bennett Herron.
Well, I guess in the context that we're speaking, I think obviously during that time period, particularly early on, much of the civil rights movement locally centered around the actions and the activities orchestrated by Charles Keller, quite frankly. I think he was very, very much a part of the central role, played a central role in what I think both of our fathers were working for. He had been denied the right to practice law, so during that time period he was very much available to organize and keep up a lot of activity and make the local branch of the NAACP very effective in the civil rights movement. So I remember as a child a lot of meetings at various households and being kind of lugged around during that time period. But it was a very, very hectic and very busy time. There was always an issue to be resolved and people were coming together as a community, but certainly Mr. Keller providing a lot of guidance and advice during that time period.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
My recollection is very consistent with Judge Bennett Herron's recollection, and I call her Karen because
right.
we grew up together, and we don't go back as far as the 50s,
no.
but certainly in the 60s. And my recollection was that there were a very small number of professional people in our community who were African Americans. Of the lawyers, I certainly remember Charles Keller. I remember Robert Reed, Del Guy, who became a judge, Judge Guy, and Earl White, who also became a judge. But during that period of time, there was a lot of struggles because Southern Nevada and the state was segregated. And you had this small group of attorneys who made tremendous efforts in desegregation. And both Karen and I were very fortunate in the fact that our parents demanded something much greater than mediocrity in terms of being professionals. So we grew up around the Charles Kellers, the Earl Whites, the Judge Robert Reed, and Judge Guy, and it made a tremendous impact. I can tell you, and I'm sure Karen will agree with me, it made a tremendous impact on our lives and how we ended up being lawyers ourselves, but also other young people in the community have certainly benefited from those individuals and the path that they took and the doors that they opened for us.
And if I could ask one follow-up question, and then we'll move to Mr. Evans. Could either of you speak, or both of you speak to the issues that your parents, but also Charles Keller and the early attorneys were trying to address in the civil rights context? So segregation or other issues that civil rights activists were addressing?
They were focusing very much so on education. I think, and I remember there always being this constant reference to the fact that, I know at least when my dad first came to Las Vegas, most of the African Americans in West Las Vegas were being retained or held back in the first grade, you know, so there were a lot of issues surrounding education. There were certainly a lot of issues surrounding employment and access to opportunities for employment. Certainly just this whole notion of segregation, as John pointed out, you know, they were fighting the good fight. Every aspect of the civil rights movement was very much alive and well during that time period. And there were this cluster that, as John has pointed out, we were so fortunate to have in our lives that, you know, kind of showed us what it meant to make the sacrifice and to understand that you're fighting for something much bigger than self, you know. So.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I can add much to that other than what I recall during those years was the segregation between the west side of Las Vegas and the rest of Las Vegas. And that was during the period when we had what we call the riots. And I remember the lawyers that we just mentioned and our parents being in the forefront and in the middle of that cause, along with many other people, non-African Americans, such as Grant Sawyer and Hank Greenspun, who were trying to make Las Vegas something other than a segregated city. And I remember those times pretty vividly. And it was important that we as a community stood up and said that we're not going to be treated a certain way. And of course, at the end of that process, it's all about opportunities. We wanted the same opportunities as everyone else in this community, and indeed this nation, in terms of progressing from an educational standpoint and from an employment standpoint.
Thank you. So I'd like to move on to Mr. Evans. And I know that in the early 1970s, before you became an attorney and before you went to law school, you worked at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas as a counselor and actually taught a lot of students who then later became some of the early African-American attorneys who actually grew up here in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I actually arrived at UNLV in August of 1970, and a gentleman named Edmund Lewis, who had been hired as a counselor and recruiter, had recruited the first large group of African-American and Hispanic students. He was an African-American guy who was very proficient in speaking Spanish. So he recruited a lot of both black and Hispanic students to UNLV. So it was the first large group, and including that group were Judge Gates, Lee Gates, who would become Judge Gates, Dave Phillips, Jeannie Banks, was a part of that group. Andres Barbero was part of that group. There was an energy about that, and people were pursuing not only the educational goal, but just goals in the community to make the community a better place. Both from the standpoint of really effective people in the community, aside from the people that we've kind of spoken about. Kenny Gwynn, who was then the superintendent of schools, had done a masterful job of recruiting a significant number of black educators to this community. Those educators, working with the community leaders, had began to improve the education for minority students, black and Hispanic, in this community, and began to work toward a better job situation. One of the people that I got to know, who was a lawyer, who hasn't yet been mentioned, was Robert Archie, who was really at the forefront of the consent decree that allowed African Americans to be employed in significant numbers on the Strip, in the hotels, in all capacities. He worked with Greenspun, he worked with certainly Keller and Bailey, and Bob Archie, for a period of a couple of years, was in the early 70s, was the president of the NAACP. So those kinds of things were really helpful, and as I said, it brought a different energy. And I think that was the if you will, the impetus that made me and perhaps Judge Gates and others like us want to go to law school. You saw the law as a vehicle that could implement change in the community. So went away and we returned in the late 1970s. So.
Thank you very much. And so now I'd like to bring both Justice Douglas and Judge Williams into the conversation. And each of you came to Las Vegas in the 1980s. And what's interesting is, although we don't have as many female attorneys or judges on the panel at this moment, this is also the time period where we see women entering the legal profession in Nevada. And I'd like to ask if each of you could speak a bit about the community or the legal community that you saw coming from another location and what it was like, and also perhaps compare it to the communities that you had come from. And we'll start with Justice Douglas and then go to Judge Williams.
I think, in a word, it was a little bizarre. I came here in July of '83, and I came in as a legal services attorney. And so my first year I was admitted under a special rule. I took the bar the following year. But I can remember vividly the first time I went down to a courtroom, and I was following another attorney, and there was a matter, and a young man was paying a criminal fine, and he paid his fine. He said, "Your Honor, if I pay this, will I have to come back, because I now live in Barstow?" And the judge said, "I want you here," and he started laughing, and the young man said, "Have a nice day." And the judge jumped up and said, "Bailiff, put him in cuffs, take him away." And I said, "What am I getting myself into here in Las Vegas, Nevada?" It was a little bit about the Wild West. But having said that, I had been in and out of Las Vegas prior to that, because I originally come from Los Angeles. I had a cousin who moved up to here, the late Paul Dawkins, who was with one of the television stations, a news broadcaster. So I understood people didn't live in the hotels. What I really didn't understand was how segregated Las Vegas was, and the limitation of black professionals coming out of Los Angeles, having gone to school in the San Francisco area, and then been in practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then coming to Las Vegas. Coming here at that time, and I was kidding Booker earlier about being the elder statesman, but there was basically about 10 black attorneys practicing in the state of Nevada, the whole state. And as was talked about earlier, the 60s with Keller, who took the bar and then wasn't admitted for character reasons. Then Robert Reed and Earl White coming out of Howard and coming here and being admitted prior. Then Del Guy. That's the 60s group. And then we turn to the 70s, and the 70s was instrumental because you had your first Nevadan coming home to practice, a Bob Archie. And that was part of that group, and both Judge Bennett Harrod and John Bailey, as well as Gary Booker, they were part of the first group, and Dave Phillips, I can't forget David, the first group of Nevadans coming back to Las Vegas. because one of the things I looked at, and some of the other attorneys who preceded me, the Marcus Coopers and the other folks in town, is like, where are the local kids? How come they're not coming back? And they weren't coming back because of lack of opportunity. There was a glass ceiling, or you can call it something else if you want, but there was definitely a ceiling. And of those people that I talked about, a lot of them, their parents were first to work on the Strip because blacks were put downtown only, or first to work out at the test site. So when you have an Art Williams who became chief counsel at the test site, or Andres Barbera who became chief counsel for one of the banks in town later during the 80s, that was really significant. But we have the 60s, we have our attorneys in the 70s, and Booker being one of them. Then in the 80s, I'm part of the 80 group, and in the 80s, folks start coming back in, and very important part of the 80s, we had our first 2 female black attorneys, and one presently sits on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Thank you. Now, of course, Judge Williams, we've saved you for last, and we've talked a little bit about people who've grown up here, and we've talked about local attorneys, and Justice Douglas has opened the door to the story of migrating attorneys, and of course, you come from actually a series of migrating attorneys from a particular region, but let me open the door and let you tell stories yourself.
Oh, I appreciate that, and first I have a couple of comments because my life experiences were a little bit different than those that are on this panel, because I grew up in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, in fact. And so as a result of that, African Americans had always played key roles in the community as a whole. And that was my blueprint. I mean, I went to an all African American grade school, an all African American high school. All my teachers were African American. My principal was African American. So I didn't really think that was a big deal, because that's how it was for me. You know, our alderman was African American. So when I moved to Las Vegas, that's the first thing that struck me, because it appeared that the struggles that were being fought at that point had been fought 20 to 30 years earlier in the city of Chicago. You know, because Chicago's been a very progressive city. But I don't want to look at myself as, I guess, a carpetbagger per se, because I moved here in 1985. But I think I was part of, when I look back in retrospect, that first group of migrant African American attorneys to move to Las Vegas, and I think because of the labor and the fruits of the struggles of the African American lawyers in the 60s and 70s, there were just certain opportunities that had, for the first time, become available for African American lawyers in, say, 1985. And I give an example. I remember when I moved here, my first job was working for a law firm. It was the Gallus Law Firm, and they hired me, and I don't think they've ever had any African American lawyers before then. But interestingly, I remember I was actually being recruited by another law firm, Beckley Singleton, and I think I potentially might have been. Gary Booker and I would have been the first African American lawyers there, but I decided I wanted to stay. Gary went to Beckley, and also I guess it would be the same thing for John Bailey, because I remember I met John. He probably didn't remember this, but this was at a party at Greg Morris's house. And I think it was his birthday party. And I think you had just come home and you were getting ready to work for Lionel Sawyer. And that was all in the same time period, you know. And so I guess I would say the mid-1980s was probably that time period when I won't say there wasn't a breaking of the glass ceiling, but there were more opportunities for African American and other minority lawyers working for private law firms at that point. And I think you'd probably agree with that, John.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll start opening up questions to the group. So we've talked a little bit about education, we've talked a little bit about civil rights, and I think you started opening the door to these conversations about employment, where people work, and we might want to talk more about the different people, but let me also let the discussion flow where it goes a bit. And of course, Mr. Evans.
You know, as Tim was talking, it brought back a memory for me. When I arrived back from law school and wanted to work where I could learn to do trial work, I wanted to go to the district attorney's office. And John actually spent a summer there with us after his first year. but there weren't any other African-American attorneys in that office. Judge Guy had been there and was by then on the bench. And the then sitting district attorney sat in an interview panel with me and explained to me that he had had an African-American law clerk a couple of years before, and it hadn't worked out very well. Well, it was during an election year, and Bob Miller was running for governor. I mean, for district attorney. He'd be the governor at some point, but he was running for district attorney. And I guess I was wise enough to have read the paper enough to know that he was going to win the election. So I cold called him. I actually picked up the phone and dialed him and asked him if there was any way I could get a job when he became the district attorney. He told me to stay by the phone, called down, and they agreed to put me at juvenile for the few months after I had passed the bar until Miller took office. And that's how I got a job at the district attorney's office. And then Johnny Rawlinson, who's now in the Ninth Circuit, when she came, also she wanted to work at the DA's office, and we were able to get her, involved there. But this wasn't just the legal community here wasn't just it didn't just have barriers for African Americans. I mean, there were no women in that office. I mean, in the district attorney's office, they had one, when I started, one deputy district attorney, a woman who had been there and did kind of minimal work, and that's all they would allow her to do. So we were all brand new, and it became incumbent on us to be very good at what we did. And if we weren't very good at what we did, we knew that there wouldn't be an opportunity for the people that were coming after us. So.
And for me, that's so bizarre. I'm going to be really frank with you, because when I left Chicago in 1985, the city attorney for the city of Chicago was African American.
Yeah.
We had an African American mayor.
Yeah.
And so, and I remember because I worked in Chicago for 2 years before I moved to Las Vegas, and that was routine. There were African American judges. I mean, it was second nature. I mean, no one even considered that to be an issue if an African American wanted to work in the state's attorney's office. I knew plenty. In fact, I was back for a reunion with some high school classmates, and I have quite a few friends that were African American that are working in all sorts of jobs in the public and private sector that are legally related, and those are struggles I didn't have to really consider in the Midwest. That's just how it was.
The one thing I would add is the attorneys, the African American. First of all, we use the term African American. When we were growing up, we were just black. But the attorneys that we're describing, once they got the opportunities, they made the most of it. And I'll give you an example. Booker, and he's far too modest and humble to say this, but he indicated he started in the DA's office. When I came back to Las Vegas, it was probably during the time that I was in law school or right after graduating from law school. I did some work and worked for the DA's office in the appellate division, and Booker was a star in the DA's office. Everyone I bumped into said, "You got to go watch Booker Evans in court because he's amazing." And I did that, and they were all absolutely right. My point is that he made the most out of those opportunities, the same way Justice Douglas did. I first met Mike back in the mid-'80s, and he was working at the DA's office in the civil division. In a relatively short period of time, he becomes not only a district court judge, but he elevates himself through hard work, through his character, through his abilities to be on the Nevada Supreme Court, and was the first black justice on the Supreme Court and the first black chief justice on the Nevada Supreme Court. So that speaks volumes as to, given the opportunities and given a pathway, you can achieve anything.
Interesting thing, though, during that time period of the 80s, especially as the numbers start coming in, was the camaraderie of the black attorneys. And we used to kid about if we had 5 of us on the street corner, it might be a riot. But we made a point of trying to have lunch once a week or at least twice a month to talk about the practice, to give each other tips, or to say, there may be a job there. If someone was trying to transition from a public defender's office or who had just come into town. And also the mentorship of Judge White and Judge Guy especially. And Judge Guy you almost didn't want to appear in his courtroom. He wasn't going to play favorites, but you knew he was going to make you work harder. And it's a little thing for someone who's of legal significance to understand. If you quote a bunch of cases in a brief, just to say this is a point, Judge Guy would ask you about each case to make sure you had read it. So you got to the point you only wanted to cite one case in your best case because you didn't want to learn the other cases.
You know, I think that dealing with that and talking about the judges and the impact that they had, you know, Judge White was very stern on the bench. Different person off the bench, very jovial, very down to earth. You know, Jimmy Porter was just a fantastic person to be around, to learn from. Being in the district attorney's office, I got to try cases against Bob Archie and against Jimmy Porter and against Marcus Cooper, and of course it was awakening for the majority members who would come in as jurors to see, you know, two African-American attorneys, you know, contesting a criminal matter, one defending, one prosecuting. From there, I had an opportunity to go to the United States Attorney's Office to always wanted to do a more sophisticated practice, a little more sophisticated practice than was available at District Attorney's Office. I call that the cut 'em, shoot 'em, beat 'em kind of cases. And so when I got over there, I learned to do, you know, tax cases and criminal tax and paper cases and things of that nature. But I also knew, and this got to be the mid-'80s, and this was when I made the decision actually to expand and go to Phoenix with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I made that decision because there were still not significant opportunities for me to develop the kind of practice that I knew I wanted to develop long term. So I left to go to Phoenix, Arizona, and I've ended up working now both in Phoenix and Las Vegas because of that. And I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office down there. I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office there for maybe 6 months and was getting recruited by every law firm in town. I mean, and it was just an amazing difference. I mean, people would see me in court or in a trial, and immediately I'd get a phone call saying, do you want to stay in that office or do you want to come work with us? And so that's how my career has evolved. Now, subsequently, we see this growth of national firms. Greenberg, Traurig, the firm I work with now, has 1,800 lawyers around the world, and we have 31 offices. We have an office here, LA. You know, I'm licensed here, so I come and work in the office here and work cases here, work cases in Phoenix, work cases in Atlanta. So it really, I say this though to say, you know, to digress back to this point, the people that I grew up with as a legal practitioner provided me with a basis to do that, the confidence to do that, and in many ways the ability. Judge Guy, a taskmaster, Judge White, a taskmaster. They were really demanding of me.
It was the point that you're talking about, that transition, but the change as we began to get numbers here in Las Vegas, and everyone wasn't going to work for the public defender's office or legal services or the DA's office. It ushered in from the solo practitioners, the Earl Whites and the Bob Archies, their own offices, because basically there wasn't a place for them to work in the majority firms. And all of a sudden you have John Bailey and you have Tim Williams working on the other side doing civil. You have Karen Bennett coming in Heron, the judge now, and representing entities, public entities, which was unheard of before. So things began to go, and all of a sudden the Golden Goose in town, we looked and we had some minority folks, black attorneys, working for gaming properties, chief counsel and of counsel. And one of our early scholarship recipients working of counsel for a major firm and becoming a senior vice president. So a lot of things have happened, but it changed.
Like Rose McKinney James, who didn't want to practice law, but used her law degree to just become an icon in the gaming industry. I mean, she's fantastic, and you realize that it's the legal education and that catapulted her and allowed her to do what she's now doing.
And so we've talked a bit about the work context. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the people. We've mentioned a lot of the names, and of course each of you knew the people that we're talking about extremely well. In many contexts, either they mentored you, you worked with them, as you mentioned, you've litigated against them. We mentioned Charles Keller, we mentioned Judge Guy, we mentioned Bob Archie, we mentioned so many people. Maybe we can pick up some of the people and you can share a little bit about what you knew about the different people, both about their practices and about them as attorneys more broadly.
I will tell you that Bob Archie had the richest speaking voice that I would kind of say that any of us have ever heard.
Today, right?
It was
no, Allstate
marvelous.
commercial. You could do an Allstate commercial.
Very seriously, you could be outside the courtroom if you didn't have a case against it, and you knew it was him. It was so rich, and he was such a pleasure. It was such a pleasure to watch him, to hear him, and to go through that. Jimmy Porter had a marvelous style with people, a way of communicating with jurors, a way of talking to jurors where they felt as if they knew him. Jurors would come out feeling like, I want to go home with Mr. Porter. He's a good guy, and I can, with those two, I had an awful lot of contact with, and just admired both of them greatly.
So, of course, you were on the other side of cases that they litigated often, and people talk about early cases, particularly, and we know, for example, that James Porter was with legal aid, and that early cases that people are litigating, particularly civil rights cases, are often cases that one loses because you have to start building the case law. Do you remember any of the cases, for example, that they worked on, either win or lose, that you thought were important or significant, and why?
Well, before I went to law school, the early cases that set up the premise for the consent decree were lost. Those were lost, and they were worked by Keller, by Archie, by attorneys from the Southern Christian Leadership, from the NAACP. Attorneys would come in from outside. I mean, and not all African American attorneys. People really worked very hard because we were only 2 or 3 years in 1970 past the time when they first started to allow African American entertainers to live in the hotels. I mean, in the hotels they were entertaining in. I mean, 64, 65, 66, that wasn't happening. So all those battles had to be fought. I can recall Dave Phillips' mother, Ruby Duncan, organizing group welfare mothers, and we had a march down the strip, and in the front of that march, I have to admit I was there. I was right in the front of the march, and a little bit of maybe what they would term in those days a bit radical and a bit outspoken, but Reverend Abernathy, Jane Fonda, there were a number of high-profile celebrities that came from outside of Nevada. And it was the only time, as I understand, that the strip was closed aside from the Kennedy assassination, the days after the Kennedy assassination.
And of course, one of the things I think you're raising here, and perhaps each of you can also speak to this from your experience, is this working of the legal community with other aspects of the African American community, and in fact being embedded in the community as a whole. So working with the churches, working with business people, but actually people being part of each of these communities or multiple aspects of the African American community and the broader Las Vegas and Nevada community at the same time.
No, I think it's a really good point, and it's something that, I was thinking about what Tim said about Chicago and it being a much older city than Las Vegas, but also probably having advanced much further than Las Vegas had. And so, it's difficult I can imagine, to walk into a situation and feel as though you're in a time machine and like, wait a minute, where am I? Why is this taking so long here? Or why is this such a big deal? And I think it's something that I know we as natives don't really take for granted, because what you saw and what you were able to witness, I think even as a child, is the evolution not only of the African American legal community, but the African American professional community overall. So you start to see an influx of more black educators. I mean, it was, 6th grade before we had a an African-American teacher, Ms. Raphael, you know, and she was the only one I had until, you know, I think until I left here and went away to college. So, you know, you start to see this influx. Yeah, it's amazing.
And that's very difficult for me because, I mean, my family grew up in both Chicago and Gary, Indiana. And if you know anything about Gary, Indiana, all it is a suburb of Chicago. And like my uncle was Lake County, Indiana coroner. He ran against Richard Hatcher for mayor of Gary, Indiana back in the 60s. And so these struggles here, as far, and I mean, all my family, they're educators. They taught in the Gary public school system, the Chicago public school system. And so, you know, someone of my age having, going to a school with very few or limited African-American school teachers is just really bizarre to me. I just
right, but it happened.
I know,
and it did happen. But I think what is more important is that
it really is,
because of the constraints, or the glass ceiling, or the cement wall, or the block wall, or whatever it is that you want to call it, there was an overlap and a huge camaraderie between the various areas, whether it be the lawyers, the teachers, the preachers, everybody, the welfare rights activists, people who lived in public housing, the people, there was no class distinction. There was an understanding that it took the whole in order to propel us forward. And it may have worked in a slower fashion, but it also worked, I think, in a much more aggressive fashion. Because unlike Chicago, had Booker been in Chicago, he wouldn't have been the rock. I mean, he would have been a rock star, don't get me wrong, but he wouldn't have been the only rock star.
right. Absolutely.
We were still, you know, this is not to diminish anything, but to walk into a courtroom and be astonished to see an articulate African-American man would not have happened in Chicago.
Right.
It happens every day in Las Vegas.
I mean,
still.
for example, when I moved here, Michael Montgomery was a city attorney in Chicago in the mid-'80s. I mean, think about it for a second. And that's the position he had.
Well, but because of that, it allowed people to, as John has so eloquently said, make the best and the most, and to expand that opportunity, and to make it available and open up pathways a lot more aggressively than would have happened had it not been such a novelty. Because now he opens doors, Mike opens doors, Tim, everybody kind of comes in and they're able to just, it's a floodgate as opposed to, you know, a trickle. So,
you know, you and John hit upon something, you just, in discussing the 6th grade thing, something that comes back to me, because it was in the late 60s, just before I arrived here, that they created this 6th grade center.
right, but I think we kind of avoided that.
You avoided that.
After us,
yeah, they created the 6th grade center. What they did for the people out there who don't know is they created a situation in order to integrate the schools. The people were bussed out of the west side of Las Vegas to all the other schools in the county for all grades except the 6th grade. And in the 6th grade, everyone else was bussed into the black community. So it was just an amazingly contrived way to desegregate schools.
Now, I'm going to go back to Judge Williams for a moment, because I did want to make sure that we get a chance to ask you to talk a little bit about Judge Guy, because I think that one of these stories of people coming from other locations is this story of bringing some of these ideas with, and I think that Judge Guy was a significant, well, we all know he was a significant figure, but let's give an opportunity to talk about some of the things that he did, and also maybe how his experiences played a role in his willingness or comfort in doing that, or maybe it was just himself.
Well, I can say a couple of things about Judge Guy. Just coincidentally, he's from Chicago also. first and foremost, Wendell Phillips High School, by the way. And Judge Guy, for anyone migrating to Las Vegas during that time period, was like a portal to the legal community, really and truly he was. And I think his hands were all over anyone that had moved here at that time. And not in a way where he was obtrusive or forceful, but we looked at Judge Guy as a person we could go to for advice. And I think a lot of us, I know I don't forget this, but sometimes it's overlooked, but he was like a landing spot for a lot of people migrating here in the legal community. For example, my younger brother was a law clerk for Judge Guy. Carl Armstrong, who moved here from Chicago, by the way, was a law clerk for Judge Guy. But what I really respected about Judge Guy, number one, he expected excellence from everyone that would practice law, and he let you know that. But just as important, too, I think because he came from Chicago, he had a somewhat of a global perspective. Because I can remember him telling me this. He says, look, Tim, because I was very active at the time with the National Bar Association, and he would say, this is good, but I want you to become the president of one of 3 organizations. He would say, you got to be either state bar president, Clark County bar president, or Nevada Trial Lawyers Association president. Because he understood the importance of being in positions where you make the decision and not being on the outside. And he really emphasized that. And I think as a result of Judge Guy and that being his philosophy, there were members of the NBA that became presidents of those specific organizations at his urging.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Bailey, I know you were the...
want me to talk about Judge Guy?
If you want to, you certainly should. I was actually going to ask you, as I'm keeping a bit of an eye on the time as well, I was actually going to ask you, since I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were the first African-American at a large law firm, a large local law firm here in Las Vegas, about how your interactions, and you mentioned this very early on in our conversations here, your interactions with the early African-American legal community affected you and perhaps may have influenced you into becoming an attorney.
Well, I think you are correct that I probably am the first African-American. At the time I was black, now I'm African-American, but the first black attorney at a major law firm. And at the time, and it may be even true today, Lionel Sawyer & Collins was the state's largest firm. As I look back on it, I can talk about perhaps the significance of that. At the time that it was occurring, it never dawned on me that that was significant one way or the other. I was, as I grew up, I was always surrounded by professional people, African Americans, not a lot, but the people we mentioned, also physicians like Dr. McMillan, Dr. West, Dr. Creer, and all of those individuals had a real imprint on me because they all felt like I was their son in some respects, or I was family in some respects, because it was a very close-knit community then. Judge Guy, for example, lived right around the corner from us, and I was his paper boy. And he would never miss an opportunity to encourage me to get an education, to become a professional, whether it's a physician or a lawyer. Obviously, he, kind of said being a lawyer is a good thing. But, it was a very tight-knit community of professionals at the time. Karen's father, Reverend Bennett, was significant in explaining to me how important education was, as was my parents. We didn't have an option during those years whether we were going to go to college or grad school. It was just known, it was mandatory. But to answer your question, it was that kind of interface with a close-knit community of professionals that made the difference for people like me, and I'm sure for Karen and others, because without that, we would not have had the vision or the ability to see that, yeah, we really can become professionals. We really can be like the people we're seeing. And Judge Guy was instrumental in that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add too, I think, and Judge Douglas brought up a point about us being in that wave of when you start to see the first Nevadans coming back home and all of that. And I think one of the things that is really critical for people to understand, there's a legacy or a level of sacrifice that was made for us. I feel the same way about John's family. His father, his mom, everybody kind of was your father and your mom, and they expected and wanted so much from you. because and for you, because they knew it was kind of like they were all vested in your success. Everybody, whether it was Judge Guy, certainly, Dr. West, Dr. McMillan, Dr. Creer, Mrs. Creer, everybody wanted the best no matter what. They wanted you to succeed. And so you almost felt an obligation to come back, and an obligation to come back and to serve, not just to be present and say, okay, I got mine, but also to serve and to kind of keep that legacy going. So we were a relatively young professional community, but as John's pointed out, very close-knit and very vested in the next generation coming forward and putting forth that level of commitment that we witnessed first up, you know.
And Karen,
They did
you
a
make a
tremendous job of adopting us, too. I mean, they thought that people still think that I grew up here. I could go around and people think I grew up in Las Vegas because the Goinses, the Creers, and the group adopted me as part of the Las Vegas community.
And I think that's an important issue to really bring forward, because I moved here from Chicago, like I indicated a little bit earlier, but it wasn't a closed community. I was accepted readily. I mean, I look back and some of the relationships, like Dr. Creer. I was Dr. Creer's lawyer, you know, and he really pushed me. He'd come into my office and say, "You're doing wonderful things, Tim," you know. And I represented Dr. Charles Keller. I was his lawyer later in his career. But it was a real acceptance when I moved here. It was like, you know, certain parts of the South, if you move in from the North, you're not necessarily accepted. But when I moved here to Las Vegas in 1985, I felt very much accepted. Your father, you probably didn't know this, but he took, when I was appointed to the district court bench, in his way, he helped with that process.
Now, if I could, as we're starting to get closer to the close, Justice Douglas, if I could ask you in a sometimes role reversal to comment on Judge Bennett Herron's role as the, first and only African-American woman in our judicial system, both in the context of the early women, the first women who came into the African-American community, and then in the context that she just mentioned of this carrier, of this service role.
In the state.
In the state, I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry, in the state, excuse me, so sorry. I may have misspoken, so sorry. Yes, excuse me, so sorry, in the state, yes.
As I said earlier, to give deference, our first black women came in the 80s.
Yeah.
And Karen is kind of a baby in that, but she has very broad shoulders. And she's had to bear two different burdens, one being black and the second being a female.
Yeah.
Those are critical barriers in the legal profession. She came to the bench. She was elevated to be the chief judge in Las Vegas. And no one likes the chief judge. And it's even worse, you're black and you're female. So if you're assertive, things get said. She's done her job and she's done it very well. So she set the mark for acceptance, so it's going to make it much easier for the next person after her. But before that, she also set standards, as I said, in her private setting, her private law firm, representing agencies for the city of Las Vegas as a private practitioner. That was unheard of before. So she's been a trailblazer for quite a long time. Her dad, we've mentioned him, but a lot of folks forget he was one of the first black state elected officials.
There we go. Yeah.
He opened doors. And so she had a great teacher. And we talked about being adopted. I was going to talk about that, but one of the things, as Booker touched upon, when you came in, the community was so happy to see someone who was going to be professional and could contest as an equal.
You were embraced.
Right. And you were embraced as long as you did your job.
That's right. That's right.
Because they wanted somebody to be proud of.
That's right.
You were embraced.
Let me, if I can, let me add one other, I don't want to say it's a burden, but one other thing that Karen has to deal with being on the bench, and that is because she grew up here, many of the people that she sees as defendants are people that she knows, or she knows their families. And I'm sure, and she can talk to this, but I'm sure it's very difficult at times to apply the law the way it has to be applied. and at the same time demonstrate a level of compassion for people that you know and families that you know. That's another burden when you've grown up here and now you're a judge. You're seeing people that you grew up with and family members that you grew up with. That's got to be difficult.
Okay.
You know, you guys are giving me a lot of credit for a lot of things. I don't really think it's, it may be, I guess, sometimes a burden, but it really hasn't been. It's been more of a blessing. This community has been so good to me from the cradle to now senior citizenship, apparently. But
I'm going to interrupt you right at that
Okay.
point because that's a great comment. So I'm going to give everyone an opportunity now to make a final comment, and then we'll wrap up. And why don't we go ahead and go in the reverse order from that which we started, which means we'll start with Judge Williams, Justice Douglas, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bailey, Judge Bennett here.
You know, I thought about what I would say when given an opportunity to speak or make my final comment. I will say this: when I moved here in 1985, we had, I think it was 13 district court judges. 2 were African American, 1 was Latino. We fast forward to 2012. Currently, if you count the family court judges, we have 52 district court judges. And my only concern is we only have 1 African American judge on the bench, and that is me. And I would really, and so it seems like we've taken a step backwards as far as that's concerned. I would be very much appreciate the day when we have more people of color, African Americans, on the district court bench here in Clark County.
Thank you. Justice Douglas?
I echo what Judge Williams has said. Part of that, though, is impacted by the ability to work in the private sector and make long dollars. And as a friend of mine once said, they wanted their child to go to the college of their choice, not the college they could afford. And quite frankly, that's something that comes into play. And it's a sacrifice when you take the public sector jobs. But I agree with Judge Williams, there needs to be more. And all I can say was, it's been a privilege of standing on the shoulders of giants to get to where I've gotten to. I did not do it by myself. So that friendship and camaraderie in the community has been greatly appreciated. But the struggle, and Judge Guy put it, it's not the fact that I got here, it's can I pull some others along? If I'm going to be successful when it's all over, it's not about what I did, but could I bring anybody else along?
I think that to play off these 2 comments, from a private practitioner standpoint, I would like to see more people invited to the table that I've been privileged to sit at. And that table has benefits that go way beyond anything I ever anticipated when I started to practice. And I think that in terms of getting our students, law students, to prepare themselves for a private practice, for a more sophisticated kind of private practice, is an important thing. It's important to have judges, I mind you, but it's also important to have lawyers like John and lawyers like Karen was when she was in private practice, who can speak for the community, who can be a voice for people who can't speak for themselves. Because once you are a judge, the one thing you do lose is the ability to do that and to advocate for different kinds of positions. So we need replacements for these 3 great judges that we have. We need replacements in our community, people who can be vocal and people who can do those kinds of things.
Thank you.
First, thank you for having us here. As I reflect back on our conversation, it dawns on me that change is difficult. There's been a significant amount of change, necessary change, and there's a lot more change that needs to take place. But change is difficult, and the change took place amongst our community, but also with a lot of help from the majority. And I think we'd be remiss with not recognizing that there were a lot of people who were not Black, who were not African American, who assisted us in the change, and it's important that that assistance continues. I feel privileged to have grown up with my colleagues here, and I really appreciate, in looking back on what has been accomplished. I had a very small, insignificant role in that, but these 4 people made huge differences, and I appreciate being able to call them my friends.
Thank you.
And I think I just have to echo everything that has been said here today. I don't want to repeat, but I will say this is a phenomenal community. It has been a privilege to be able to serve because of all that I was given as a child and all the way through my adulthood, the support and the nurturing, and I just want to give it back. You know, I want to make sure, and I think what Booker says is very, very important. It's good for us to get more judges, there's no question about it, but it is especially important that we emphasize the need to have highly skilled practitioners that can advocate for various positions in all arenas, so that we continue the legacy that was laid out for us.
And thank you all very, very, very much. It's been an honor to host this conversation. And as you all know, this is just the beginning of many conversations that can be had. And I'd also like to thank all of you for doing oral histories for the Las Vegas chapter of the National Bar Association archive that expand on the conversation that we've had here, and that are also being cared for at the archive at the Weiner Rogers Law Library at the Boyd School of Law at UNLV. Thanks very much.